Hi guys, welcome to the 5.1 Factoring Out Greatest Common Factor video. In this video I'm going to show you how to take a polynomial and factor out the GCF so that you have it in the factored form. Alright, so let's get started. So first we need to know what is factoring. So factoring is actually separating a polynomial back into a product. Now remember, product means multiplying. So you're taking a simplified polynomial that you can't combine any more like terms, and you're separating it out so that you have two polynomials that are multiplying each other. So let me show you what that looks like. So if we take 4a to the third minus 8a, they both have a 4 in common that you can divide out, and they both have 1a in common that you can divide out. And when you divide that out, what's left over inside the parentheses would be a squared minus 2. So essentially what you're doing is you're doing backwards distribution. So you're trying to get back to a distribution problem so that you can pull out all the GCFs and factor that polynomial. So another thing that might happen is a polynomial might not be able to be factored. And if it's not able to be factored, we call that prime. And sometimes things can't be factored because they don't have anything in common, or there's nothing that will multiply together to create that polynomial back. Alright, so let's go over the steps to factor to find a GCF. So first, to be able to find the GCF, you have to check for the coefficients for the GCF. So you're looking at the numbers that are in front of the parentheses, or the numbers that are in front of the variables, and you're trying to find the biggest number that goes into both or however many terms you have. So like for the example above, the 4, you can find 4 by multiplying by 1 and 4 and by 2 and 2. For negative 8, you can do that by negative 8 and 1, negative 4 and 2, negative 2 and 4, and so on. And the biggest number that they both have in common was the 4, so that's why we pulled it out. And then for the next thing you need to look at is the variables. So you're looking at the variables and see how many they have in common. And a to the third has 3 a's, but just a to the first power only has 1 a. So therefore, they only have 1a in common. So that's why we pulled out just 1a and made the GCF 4a. So then, step 2 says divide each term by the GCF and leave the remaining factors in the parentheses. So the way that you do that is you have to divide the 4 out of both terms, and then you have to divide the a out of both terms. And when you divide that out, what's ever left over stays inside. And you can always check your work by redistributing that back in. So like if you were to multiply 4a times a to the second power, does that equal 4a to the third? And yes, it does. And then you could multiply 4a times negative 2, and does that equal negative 8a? And that does. So you know you have the correct terms left inside those parentheses. And then step 3, just like I said, you can distribute to check your work and see if you're right. Alright, so for number 1, the directions are factor each polynomial, and if it cannot be factored, then you write the prime. Alright, so number 1, first thing you're going to do when you're learning how to do GCFs, you might have done it in middle school, but with polynomials it's a little bit different. So first thing I would recommend is writing down the 2 coefficients and finding everything that multiply to equal that. So first thing that is the coefficient would be 3, and that just is 1 times 3, and then we're going to do the 12, and that would be 1 times 12, 2 times 6, 3 times 4, and you'll notice that I go in consecutive order, so I'm going through and finding 1 times what, 2 times what, 3 times what, and so on, so that you make sure you get them all. And then all you're going to do is try to find the ones that are in common. Now you can also, over here on the side, because there's an x, find what multiplies to be x, and that would just be x times 1. So that doesn't have anything in common with the 3 or the 12. So now you're just going to find any matches. So there's a 3 in the first column for the coefficient of 3, and there's also a 3 in the 12, and that's the highest one they have in common. They both have a 1 in common, but that's the lowest common factor. We're looking for the greatest common factor. So we're going to pull that 3 out, and what's left behind is after you divided 3 out of each term. So 3 divided by 3x would just be x left over, and 12 divided by 3 would just be a 4. So that's what we leave inside the parentheses, and then you can check your work. So we would multiply 3 times x, which is 3x, and 3 times 4, which is 12. and you see that it matches the original problem, so you know you have the correct answer. So you're just going to circle it, and that is your factored GCF of this polynomial. All right, so for number 2, again, same directions. This time we have 7, and you can notice right away they both have a 7 in common because that's the only numbers that are in a 7, because 7 is prime. Prime means that you can only multiply a number by itself and 1 to get that number. So 7 times 1 is the only way we can get to 7, by multiplying by whole numbers. So I'm just going to show you, even though we know that it is 7, how you would do it is you make sure that you write 7 and then 7y and negative 7. Now you're probably wondering, why did I do this middle column right here? Why did I do 7y? And that's because we do have a variable that is in this polynomial. So we want to make sure that the variables, there's not another variable in the other term, that negative 7 term. And if there is a variable in common, that we make sure that we pull that out. So I just wanted to show you that you can also make the term with the polynomial and see what multiplies to equal that, so that you can find those in common as well. All right, so 7 has 7 times 1, 7y has 7 times y, and negative 7 has either 7 times negative 1 or negative 7 times 1. And they all have a 7 in common, so that means 7 is our GCF. So if we pull out 7, so 7y divided by 7 would just leave us with y, and negative 7 divided by 7 leaves us with negative 1. And we can check our work by distributing. So 7 times y is 7y, and 7 times negative 7, negative 1 is negative 7. So that checks out, so that means that's our answer after we pull the GCF out. All right, so for number 3, I'm going to have you do things a little bit different because we've got variables in both terms this time. So I'm going to show you a different way that you do it, so that you can make sure you include all of the common factors. All right, so for 8m, I just want you to think of how do you multiply to equal 8m? And that would be 2 times 4 times m, right? So now look at those 3 numbers in variable, or 2 numbers in variable, and see if you can break it apart even more. And I know that 4 is equal to 2 times 2. So 2 times 2 times 2 times m equals 8m, because 2 times 2 is 4, times another 2 is 8, and 8 times m is 8m. So that's what I want you to do. It's called the expanded form, so that you're finding everything that multiplies to equal whatever term you're looking for. Do the same thing to 36n. So originally we thought of 4 times 9 times n. So 4 can be broken up into 2 times 2, 9 can be broken up into 3 times 3, and then n is obviously by itself. So now looking at this row right here, now you're going to try to find something in common. So they both have 2 2's. So 2 2's, we have to multiply those 2's back together to get the GCF, which would just be 4. So 4 is our GCF, and we pull that out. When you divide 8m by 4, you get 2m. If you divide 36n by 4, you get 9n. So we can check to make sure we're right. So 4 times 2m is 8m, and 4 times 9n is your 36n, so that works. So that is our answer. 4 times parentheses 2m plus 9n. All right, so for number 4, same thing. We're going to find everything that multiplies to be 4y squared. So that's 2 times y times y. And then you're going to find everything that multiplies to be negative 24y. Now notice I pull over that negative that was right here, because it's important, because that 24y is not positive, it's negative. So whenever you have a negative term, you just put negative 1 times whatever it takes to get to that term. So negative 1 times what equals 24 is 4 times 6 times y for the 24y. Then we're going to break apart the 4 and the 6 into 2 times 2 and 2 times 3. And I copied down the negative 1 and the y next to it. And I also want the left side where the 4y squared is to be in the same line. So I'm just going to write it down so that it's in the same line so we can find what's in common. So they both have a 2, and they have another 2, and they both have 1y. So we're going to pull those 3 matches down and multiply them back together. So 2 times 2 is 4, times y is 4y. and that becomes our GCF. Now I want you to notice something. If you look at the term or the line where we drew underneath and we were trying to find what was in common, look what's left over that we didn't circle. So on the left hand side we didn't circle y, so that's left over. And on the right hand side we didn't circle -1 or 2 or 3, so when you multiply that back together, -1 times 2 times 3 is -6, and that's left over. So if you're having a hard time figuring out how to find what's left over inside the parentheses, if you do this method, whatever you didn't circle is what's left over because you didn't multiply it back together. It's left over inside the parentheses. So that might help you be able to identify what's inside. All right, so now we're going to distribute to make it sure that we have the correct answer. So 4y times y is 4y squared, and 4y times -6 is your -24y. So that checks out, and that would be our answer. All right, so for number 5, you're going to do the same thing. Find what multiplies to be 14gh and what multiplies to be -18h. And that would be as follows. And you can simplify the 9 on the right-hand side. So you're going to do 3 times 3 and expand it out. We're just going to copy down the left-hand side because you can't simplify that even further. So then we find out what matches on each side. They both have a 2 and they both have an h. So you multiply those back together and get 2h. So that's our GCF. And what's left behind that we didn't circle is what's left inside our parentheses. So we have 7 times g, which is 7g on the left-hand side. And we have -1 times 3, which is -9. So we're going to check our work and see if we're right. So 2h times 7g does equal 14gh. And 2h times -9 does equal -18h. So those two match, which means we are correct. So our final answer is 2h times parentheses 7g minus 9. All right, so for number 6, we're going to do the same thing. What multiplies to be 15a squared b and -30ab. So on the left-hand side, you've got 3 times 5 times a times b. A times a will give you that a squared. And on the right-hand side, we've got to have that -1 in order to get -30. So -1 times 5 times 6 times a times b. Now you notice that I write them in consecutive order and alphabetical. So I start with my lowest number on the left-hand side, and I go to the next highest, and I start with my lowest letter, and then I go to the next highest. That's important so that you can find the matches a little easier so you don't leave anything out. All right, next thing, you're going to just copy down the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we're going to expand 6 into 2 times 3. And then we're going to find everything we have in common. So on the left-hand side, I start with my 3, and we have a 3 in common on both sides. Then I go to the 5, and do we have a match on the right-hand side? We do. Then I go to my a. We have an a on the right-hand side. Do we have another a? No, so I didn't circle that one. Do we have a b? Yes, so I circled that one. So then we multiply those back together, 3 times 5 times a times b, and you get 15ab. So that becomes our GCF, and then whatever we left behind becomes the answers inside the parentheses. So we're going to pull the a and make that the left-hand side, and then right-hand side is -1 times 2, which is -2. So let's check our work and see if we're right. So we have 15ab times a, which is 15a squared b, and 15ab times -2 is -30a. So we know we're correct because that matches the answer from above, and that means our final answer is 15ab times parentheses a minus 2. All right, so for number 7, we'll find everything that multiplies to be ab and everything that multiplies to be -a. And so that's a times b on the left-hand side and -1 times a on the right-hand side. They both have an a in common, so that's our GCF. Put that out front. Whatever is left over stays on the inside, so b is on the left-hand side and -1 would be on the right-hand side. Let's check our work. A times b does give us ab, and a times -1 does give us -a. And that does match the original question, so we know we have the right answer. And that is our final answer for number 7. All right, so for number 8, you have a little bit more going on. You've got some coefficients, 2 variables, you've got exponents. So we're just going to do one at a time so we can make sure that we make everything correct and you guys understand it. So 16 is 4 times 4, and then there's 1b, and then c squared would be c times c. So we're going to expand out the 4 into 2 times 2, the second 4 into 2 times 2, and copy down the rest because there's nothing else you can factor out with b and c and c. It's just already simplified. Then the right-hand side, you've got 24bc, so we have 4 times 6 times b times c. 4 can turn into 2 times 2, 6 can turn into 2 times 3, and then you've got your b and c. So we're going to find everything that we have in common. So there's 3 2's that are in common, there's a b, and there's a c in common. So when we multiply that back together, 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. B and c would just be bc, so 8bc is your GCF. Put that out front. What's left behind is a 2 and a c on the left-hand side. So if we multiply that back together, you get 2c. And we have a 3 on the right, so that's a plus 3 on the right-hand side. So then let's check our work to see if we're correct. So ABC times 2C, so that's 8 times 2, which is 16. B times nothing, which is just B. And C times C is C squared. So that gives us our 16BC squared. And 8BC times 3, you just multiply the 8 and the 3, and you get 24, and then the BC just tags along. So 24BC would be your answer for that one. All right, let's see if it checks and matches the question, and it does. So our final answer would be 8bc times parentheses 2c plus 3. All right, so for number 9, again, same thing. We're going to multiply or write out everything that multiplies to equal each term. So we have 5x and then negative 13y. And so that would be 5 times x. And then on the right-hand side, that would be negative 1 times 13 times y. And you'll notice that nothing is in common. So like it says up here, if it cannot be factored, which means you cannot find a GCF, then you just write prime, and your question is your answer. So 5x minus 13y, because there is no GCF. All right, and then last one, number 10, 35a squared minus 20ab squared plus 15a. So everything that multiplies to equal 35a squared would be 5 times 7 times a. And negative 20ab squared would be negative 1 to get that negative, times 4 times 5 for your 20, a for the a, and b times b for the b squared. And for 15a, we have 3 times 5 for your 15, times a gives you the last a. So in the middle, we can actually break apart the 4 into 2 times 2. Then you're going to find what you have in common with the last thing you wrote in each column. So I underline that. So they both have a 5 in common. They do not have a 7 in common because 7's only in the first one. They do have an a in common. And the first one also has a second a, which is not in common with anything else because there's no more a's left in the middle or the last term. And the second column also has 2 b's, but the first and the last term does not have a b, so that's not in common. So we're going to take that 5a, multiply it back together. So 5 times a is 5a, that's our GCF. And then whatever's left over is what's left over inside for each part of the parentheses. So the first half is 7 times a, which is 7a. Then you have negative 1 times 2 times 2, so that's negative 4. And b times b, which is b squared, so negative 4b squared. And then you just have a positive 3 left over at the end. So if we distribute back to check our work, 5a times 7a would be 5 times 7, which is 35, and a times a, which is a squared. And then we have 5a times negative 4b squared, so 5 times negative 4 is your negative 20, and a times b squared would be just b squared. And, hold on a second, I put in a square there, but there was already one there, so I guess I didn't need it. There we go. So then we have 5a times 3 is 15a. So we're going to check to see if those match each other, and they do. So we know we have the correct GCF. So our final answer is 5a times 7a minus 4b squared plus 3. Whew, that was a mouthful. And last but not least, go Seahawks. Woo!